first question is, if one does not have the financial means to be as charitable as they would like, what are other ways one may give?
Well, one may give their time to work for that charity, a charitable organization or the charity that they support by volunteering in some capacity.
Yes, that's right. There's a lot of charitable donation given in the form of labor, and it has the advantage of being a little bit more close up and personal than a check.
Yes, in fact, one of the philanthropic principles I learned from my wife is that we would rarely give money to an organization in which we couldn't play an active part in one way or another, figuring that that was good for everyone.
Well, that may have some meaning with respect to your previous conversation, membership open.
Also, there's a lot in that phrase, as charitable as they would like.
Well, yeah. I mean, if you don't want to be charitable, you won't. Money or
right,
no.
but can you be charitable enough, really?
There's in principle no limit. I
Yes,
mean,
in principle, there's no limit.
you can give yourself to anything, and on the extreme, you give everything you have and don't care whether you persist, whether you survive it. But charitable is still charitable, and you can be charitable on the individual level too.
Yes, that's right. When one thinks about being charitable, one thinks about complicated, large, or formal situations, but it need not be.
No, you can ask yourself, what can I give that this person might appreciate, that this person might, need, or whatever. Or you can just make it a point to smile at more people.
There's a thought.
What you just mentioned, though, is an interesting question. Is it possible to be too charitable? And I think of all the criticism that was leveled against Simone Weil because she passed away from lack of nourishment when she was already suffering from tuberculosis, because she would refuse to eat any more than the rations that were given to everyone else, and in most cases would give most of her rations to people that were suffering in hospitals. And so in that case, it also brings up some of the desert mystics and ascetics who ended up passing away because they gave everything away that they owned. And it's just this question, if one is so charitable that they lose their life through their charity, is that going too far, or does it just depend on the person?
I think it depends on the person and the situation. I certainly wouldn't want to be prescriptive about that.
Yeah, my impression is that Mother Teresa, gave pretty much all of herself to her mission, and she didn't starve for it. But, if you find that seems to be your destiny, if you follow your principles or whatever, then you can decide that, all right, so I'll follow my principles and let come what may. But everybody doesn't have to do that.
No, that's the prescriptive part. I think there are a number of questions you might want to ask your fellow humans who decide to do that, but having those questions satisfied, finally it's between them and God.
Right.
Any more comments?
I think and this is just my opinion, it's not by any way right or wrong, but I think the first charity that is due is to oneself. And if a person is not charitable towards themselves first, then are they really being charitable to the others, or can they really be charitable to the others, is also a question.
Good question.
Right. Now, one doesn't usually think in those terms of charity to self. It's not invalid, though. But there's something about, seeing yourself in the other, that if your charity is sort of impersonal or universal, you can cover both bases. So, yeah, I don't know. The second commandment, which is like the first. I mean, if you can't love a human being as a spiritual being, then you may not see it in the mirror.
Well said.
But I don't think it's necessary to peer into the mirror until one sees that. One can find it and give it to others.
Right, and I think one has a right to look at any acts that seem to be idiosyncratic, individualistic, or egotistical, and just ask the question, why are you doing this?
Yeah.
I mean, that's in the nature of friendship and fellowship and compassion.
Yeah, or even just some random person you meet. I guess I'm sort of falling back on it's best to address the best part of everyone you meet.
The best part of what?
Of the person that you're encountering.
Oh, yes.
And that's all you can give, probably. I mean, in theory. And they can't necessarily receive it. But it doesn't matter because, you've acknowledged sacred reality. But it is good to love yourself as your neighbor.
Yes, well said.
And in particular, that kind of love, which doesn't have anything to do with one's individuality or one's personality.
Advaita, any more thoughts?
I think simply that all of these things come down to the individual and their mission. And that might sound really general, but I think many people are placed on this earth with a certain mission or destiny. And for some people, doing certain things or going to certain lengths in, let's say, charity that might be extreme or extreme amounts of love is certainly their destiny. Most of the saints and prophets and mystics had that vocation, I would say, but that's not everybody's vocation. And so, this is really the role of a spiritual master to tell an individual, not to tell them what their vocation is, but to help them nurture their own vocation. And just simply, I just want to reiterate one thing, that very often people look for these cookie cutter answers. Part of being human, part of God's plan for us here and now, is that we all have a different place and a different role to fill. And one of the best ways we can worship God is by taking time to look inside of us and find out what that role is, and really simply being ourselves, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, I think it makes sense.
Saida Zainab, did you have anything else to add?
No, I think we covered that one.
When one is in a position of leadership or power, how does one stay true to their principles?
Can't stay true to it. Is it really a principle?
Well, what principles are we talking about here?
I don't know.
And why is there conflict between power and staying true to one's principles?
It's not inherent.
No, but this implies that if one has power, one can ignore the various prescriptions and proscriptions of life and the path and society.
Yeah, and it shouldn't make any difference. But, we should always pay attention to what we're doing and be ready to ask, is this useful or is this harmful? Am I compromising a principle I didn't think I wanted to compromise? But, you have to watch yourself. You have to have some self-awareness.
Right.
If you have good principles going into a situation where you require some authority, then the principles really shouldn't change, unless you need to find a new one in order to acknowledge having greater responsibility.
Well, I guess on the downside of people like Cornelius Vanderbilt come to mind, who was known for saying, "Never mind the laws, don't I have the power?"
Yeah, we see a lot of that going on.
Yeah, well, maybe this question is about how can we keep from becoming one of them?
Have principles. Principles don't always align with the law, but they should most of the time.
Most of the time, yes.
Or I'm thinking even of such simple examples as, that age-old story of the person who's a great devotee of a path works their way up their path through their life because they're the person of impeccable morals and devotion. Then as soon as they become the guru, sheikh, whatever you want to call it, they suddenly abuse their power in all sorts of nasty ways. So how does one prevent that from happening within oneself?
If you find yourself in an exalted position, it shouldn't make a difference. You actually have more responsibility for your actions.
Well, first of all, you should be able to ask that question.
That's right. And especially you should not think, oh, I have arrived, I have been perfected. I think that's what happens to some of these gurus.
Yes, I think that's right. And that's often prompted by their disciples, who, of course, are after someone to worship.
Yeah.
But one of the things that can help one avoid that problem is surrounding oneself with honest friends, colleagues, and disciples, not just people who are dazed by your presence or people who are essentially yes people.
Yeah. In other words, you need to have people in your orbit that you respect.
That's right.
Who are allowed to say something that may not fall, smoothly when it comes in.
Yeah, the people around you have to be free to speak.
That's right.
And one has to find that helpful, not just an annoyance.
Right. Even though in the moment you may not want to hear it, that doesn't matter.
Always possible.
Or some part of you may not want to hear it.
Other thoughts, Zainab?
Well, I think there are two questions here, and maybe I'm mistaken, but what I understand is we're talking about when one has some principles to begin with, and they believe in something, or whether it's about ethics or religion or whatever it is, they start with a principle, and whether power then makes them forget that principle. It's not so much that they don't believe it in anymore, but the power probably has some dimension of forgetfulness or greed associated with it sometimes, that the person no longer follows or believes in that principle or has forgotten that. And the other question is about expecting that person who's in power to be perfect, which is impossible.
Put that burden on anybody.
Right, yeah. Right. And I think that expectation of expecting someone, whether the person is in power or not, to be perfect is not right. It shouldn't be there.
Yes, the person shouldn't have to be perfect, and therefore, but that doesn't mean that you should be judgmental, because that's not helpful either.
Right.
You have to accept that people are at the very least different.
Right. And I think if one thing that I have noticed in people in leadership and power, if one thing that is different from those who have forgotten their principles is the fact that they're humble. Humility plays a huge role in this, and reminding oneself of the principles that they believe in.
Yeah, you could also, or I would also say, don't identify with the position. Don't confuse the position with you, the human being. You may want to live up to some things that come with the position, that's fine. But you don't get to claim them. It's always dangerous to even claim to identify with a virtue, because that can be used to justify other behavior that maybe is not good. It's that thing, no man is good save the Father. And it's striking how many of the, Christian writers have, really many times said that, that they were still broken or they were still sinners. Good sign. I mean, you don't want to be identified with your humility either, but then it's no longer humility.
And when someone does get corrupted by power, would you say that that's a good person being corrupted by power, or is it more an unveiling of a corruption that's already deep in their soul?
It's something unattended in the soul.
Yeah, it's more of the latter. It's hard to generalize here, but it's more like something they should have known.
Right. And they should have had enough humility not to assume that they knew everything they need to know.
All right, next one. When one is invoking or meditating and a distraction comes up, what is the quickest way to dispel it?
Don't dispel it, just let it go.
Yeah.
Just don't go along with it. Oh, there's a distraction, goodbye.
Yes, and if it doesn't go away, then you accept that it's not gone away. But when we're talking about distraction, we're talking about attention. And one should learn not to allow one's attention to be captured by something that could be merely a brief distraction.
Right, these things just pop up. Sometimes they're thoughts, sometimes they're feelings. They go. You don't have to be carried away along with them.
Yeah, and they may be something you can't do anything about, construction noise or something like that. In which case, it's futile to try to dispel the thing we call a distraction, but it is very fruitful to let go of it so it no longer, drags us around.
Right. Can't not hear the construction noise.
Right, exactly.
You don't have to let it be part of you.
Yeah.
That happens throughout one's life, but when it happens, when you're actually invoking or meditating, you have something more immediate to get back to.
Right. Yeah, I mean, the activity itself.
And it's easier to let them go and get back to the invocation.
Right. But, a distraction can enter one's meditation without it necessarily being noxious.
Right. Even though, yes, it's still a distraction.
Yeah, well, you notice it. If it's too loud or too painful or something, you may not be able to not react to it. But distractions come up.
And aside from just letting them come and go, I think we've all had times that we've had something particularly distracting, something that eats away at us while we're meditating and takes us away from our meditation. Are there any tips or tricks for the novice that either of you two have learned over the years that you think would be helpful for them, other than what you just mentioned?
On a practical level, if you're invoking, you can invoke louder.
Right, or you can move, or you can change locations, or you can anything that changes the condition you're in which you've been distracted.
Right, but letting go is ultimately.
Yes, of course.
And letting go is not an effort. It's just refusing to hang on. Resisting is the effort.
All right. If one is facing a difficult decision in life, how may one find guidance?
Well, that depends a lot on the decision.
Yeah.
One can always get practical advice, and one probably should.
Sure. If you don't know what to do, find someone who knows more about it than you do, at least.
Right. You don't have to follow their advice, but you can
No.
listen to them.
That's right. First person you ask may not really give you a good answer, but if you know yourself well enough, you'll probably know that that's not a good answer. Well, and you can pray, because you may not know from where the guidance will come, but you can pray to be open to it. I mean, being open allows for all possibilities. And if you can't see your way clearly through some situation, it may be good to make sure you're not missing something. In other words, letting go even of the feeling that you just have to get rid of this thing, or even that you even have to decide in some cases.
Well, there's something about finding guidance in that the very initiative to do that means that one has taken responsibility for the problem.
Right. And that there's enough humility involved.
Right.
You think maybe somebody else might be able to help.
Yes, and of course one decision leads to the next.
Right.
And finally you either understand it or find guidance or know what you're going to do about it in the absence of those things.
Right, and there's some truth to I forget exactly how it's usually formulated. If you're your own defense in a legal situation, you have a fool for an attorney. Doesn't mean you don't know anything, but
there's also a lot to be said for putting aside all of the ratiocination about a particular issue or problem and doing whatever is intuitively clear, rather than wrestling it to death thinking that this is how you can resolve the problem. Just put all of that away and act from your deepest intuition and see what happens.
Yeah, sometimes you find guidance by trying a solution and finding out either it works or it doesn't.
And in the process, you may be opening yourself to new possibilities.
Absolutely.
I think right there you hit the nail on the head. I think that's the most important one. Of course, when it comes to certain worldly matters, maybe someone needs a financial advisor or whatever. Yeah, fine. Your own intuition doesn't guide you there, and that's fine. But I find that in most cases, all of the secular and sometimes the spiritual people that one asks for guidance don't know you as well as you know yourself. Even your best friends and family don't know you as well as you know yourself. And very often they will give you the wrong advice and then you'll follow the wrong advice. But I also think very often we can lead ourselves down all these horribly, horribly wrong paths when we intellectualize our decisions.
Yes, absolutely.
Yes.
When we intellectualize our decisions and think from the head, then we need outside advice. But if we go deep down into the recesses of our very being and let our intuition guide us, then I feel that there's something in our blood that actually will always guide us the right way.
Right.
Yes, if we can get ourselves out of the way, stop all of the conceptualizing.
Right.
And never justify despair. Don't despair about getting guidance or an answer or anything.
Right.
If it pops up, don't justify it.
Yes, indeed, Seda Badria. Getting all of these things out of the way, not dealing with them at the conceptual level, but looking to stay open to that deepest part of you that's open to possibilities. And
if the situation is too close to you, it may also be blocking a view of the solution.
I think very often we have, our intellectual self, our lower self, our nafs that thinks it wants something that's really bad for us, and we're socially conditioned in certain ways through family, through society, through language. But almost every tradition has a language for expressing something else, whether it's opening the third eye or getting in touch with the inner daemon. And I think that's the important thing. I think one has to be very careful here. One absolutely should intuitively listen to themselves, but it has to be the deep, deep, deep recesses of their being, their soul that's opened with the third eye, and not some sort of intellectual idea of intuition. And it's sometimes, if someone's not good at discernment and discerning the two, sometimes easy to mistake the one for the other. And that can lead us down horrible, horrible paths. And that's why I think it is, of course, good to have someone guiding us, because the guide can help us know whether we are on the right path or not.
Yeah, you can use an expert, even a spiritual expert, or maybe a specialist, as a reality check. You know, is the situation that you're trying to decide about really exactly as you view it? I mean, that's why it's good always to have somebody you can talk to. And I guess that's part of humility, realizing you don't know what you don't know sometimes.
And one thing that's interesting is, for the most part these days, people that are intuitively in touch with all these other possibilities, very often they're called neurotics, they're called crazy, they're ostracized, whereas not that long ago they would be considered great members of the group, the family, the clan, the society, and be made a shaman. They would be considered the shaman. And
Right.
So I just thought I'd throw that out there, how, aside from the individual, people that have a great intuitive awareness of not just their inner self, but also the outside world, were at one time the most valued members of a community, and now it's something that's actually frowned upon, sadly.
Sadly.
Yes, definitely sadly.
Anything else on difficult decisions?
All right, so I'll ask the last question for today. How does one grow older in a lighthearted, peaceful, and happy manner without the heaviness and sadness that it seems to impose upon some people?
Be here now.
Yes, but seems to be, more peaceful and more happy and lighthearted as early in life as you can. As we get older, we start to lose physical abilities at a certain point, unless you have a sudden heart attack. That's an important physical disability, I suppose. And, you just don't take everything so seriously. I mean, it sounds flippant, but it's like...
Well, the hard point here is not taking yourself too seriously.
Yes, that's always what that is. Yes. Yeah, if you can laugh at yourself easily and stop denigrating yourself, you may peacefully and happily into your old age.
Yes, and I'd say stay active and stay involved. If there's anything science has learned about happiness and aging in the last 50 years, since it's been studied really hard, is that the thing that gives pleasure and meaning to one's life is one's relationships.
Yeah.
And often when people are older, they get isolated or they find themselves not that interested, but that's a mistake. It's those things that provide a lot of peace and joy in life and allow one to take oneself less seriously. And of course, the less seriously you take yourself, the more attention you can give to that which is real.
It is true. It does have a whole lot to do, not letting your notch be the weight that keeps dragging you down.
Yeah, that's right.
Taking yourself seriously in final analysis. Because we're all just passing through.
Yes, we're all just passing through indeed. It's easier to take yourself seriously if you're alone. It's a little harder to take yourself seriously if you're in organic communications with others.
Well, yes, because it will reveal things that you wouldn't necessarily think to look for.
Right, and necessarily makes your world bigger than you.
Yeah.
And I think that is one of the problems old people have, is they become their world.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I can relate to that. I don't feel that much heaviness. And I do have human interaction.
That's good. Like this very evening, for example.
For example, yeah.
All of us humans here.
One of the things I find really helpful is to have people ask me questions.
Well,
That's what we're doing.
Advaita Vedanta is particularly good at that, so we'll just stay the course.
Right.
You know, one thing they say is many people say you're born alone, you die alone, but I actually think that's not really true if you get in touch with others. If you really establish these living, vital connections with other people, then you're never really alone. And if you really understand the nature of being, even when you're alone, you know you're never really alone.
You can't be alone.
Exactly.
Yeah. Alone would be alone.
Any more comments on staying cheerful?
Well, we've only got a couple minutes left, and in order to keep you cheerful and not frazzled on your way to wherever you have to go next, we should probably end now.
I think that's a wonderful idea. I appreciate your consideration in keeping me cheerful and calm. Thank you all.
In your old age.